Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Collier Wright, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. The relationship between clinical research sites and sponsors is one of the most critical partnerships in drug development. It's the foundation upon which new therapies are tested and brought to patients, and yet that foundation is often strained. So we're going to be exploring that with our incredible panelists here today. And just a quick note, we know there are a lot of people from a lot of different organizations in this ecosystem, and that there's a lot of friction that we'll be exploring between these different groups. I think we'll be coming from the assumption today that everybody wants to do the best by patients, and that really is the goal here is to deliver better therapies for patients faster. And so non-attributional, but we will be exploring the ways in which we can reduce some of that friction and improve working relationships here. Before we bring in those experts, I'd like to let everyone know a couple of housekeeping items. We will be taking questions from the audience throughout the webinar. So if you do have a question, please pop it in the Q&A section below. We will have time at the end to address as many of your questions as we can. We also encourage you to use the chat for any immediate reactions or comments as we go. Now, let's meet the panel. So first up, we have Christy Walters. Christy, great to have you today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So Christy is the clinical research program lead for the GI division at Duke University, where she brings deep site-side experience shaped by decades of patient care and research coordination. A former ICU nurse turned research leader, she now oversees complex trials across Duke's GI portfolio and was recently honored with the institution's inaugural Research Staff Excellence Award. Thank you for being with us today, Christy. Next up, we have Zina Sarif. Zina, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
So Zina is the founder and CEO of Yendu, the first AI-powered site engagement platform accelerating trial startup. With a background in oncology R&D and clinical operations at AstraZeneca and Parexel, she launched Yendu to help sponsors and CROs close the gap between site selection and activation, cutting months off trial timelines and getting treatments to patients faster. And last, we have Dr. Julius Wilder. Julius, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Excited to be here and excited about this conversation today.
So Julius is an associate professor of medicine at Duke University with appointments in the Duke Clinical Research Institute and Department of Sociology. He has led clinical trials across gastroenterology and hepatology and was appointed last year as vice chair for equity, diversity, and inclusion in Duke's Department of Medicine. He brings a grounded view of what academic sites need from sponsors, shaped by his experience navigating protocol demands and the resource realities that affect study participation. So I'm really excited about this conversation, and thank you all. I'd like to maybe give you all something to react to and frame up the conversation a little bit. So we have a poll to start off with. So to help frame that conversation, we'll start with this poll. And once we have some responses, I'd love to get your feedback and see how this aligns with your expectations and what your experience has been. So the poll question is, what do you see as the biggest barrier to building strong sponsor-site relationships? Our options here are limited direct communication with sites, unrealistic budgets or timelines, complex or burdensome protocols, slow contracting startup processes, and if you think it's something else, please select other and type it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, we'll give everybody a second here to get lock in their answers. Okay, so some pretty clear results here, clearer maybe than I even expected. So we've got 65% say that limited direct communication with sites is a primary point of friction and the biggest barrier to building strong partnerships. And then we have second is the slow contracting and startup process, then the unrealistic budget or timelines, and last, the complex or burdensome protocols. And I know our panelists all have some pretty strong opinions on these, and we'll have some different focus areas here. But I guess I'd like to start with Christy, since I know we've had some conversation around this idea of limited communication between sites. What has your experience been? What's the friction that gets created? Why does this limited communication exist? And what are your thoughts on how that could be improved?
So I actually was happy to see that that was the number one as well, because that was my number one, because essentially the communication actually impacts all the others that were listed. So if you don't have the communication, that direct communication, that relationship to contact somebody directly, know you can work with them, it's actually going to affect your timelines. It's going to affect your budget negotiations and contract negotiations. So that is the key element that I believe to be missing as well. Um, Ways to improve. We've kind of talked about this a little bit before. The sponsors do utilize CROs more and more frequently. Um, Years ago, we would have more contact directly with the sponsor. Now we have more of the middleman CRO managing all aspects of the trial a lot of times. And so really more of a uh, collaboration and more of a comprehensive group to work with
Mm,
between the CRO and the sponsor. Uh, Key players, and really in those times where you just need to call somebody up and get an answer very quickly. I don't need to send 20 emails. I just need to get somebody on the line, and let's escalate this immediately, is some of the best ways to actually manage. I know it's a little old school going back to the phone, but it does help, because there's a lot of email fatigue.
mm,
So having that direct conversation and kind of minimizing some of the the written email communication, and you can always follow up that verbal with a written
mm.
for documentation purposes.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've heard you say before too is look, when I just need a decision, there are lots of things that we can work out
Mhm,
operationally, but when I just need a decision, is there somebody that I can call? You
mhm.
you have a lot of experience. Do you have maybe any examples without naming any names of where you've seen this go well and where you've seen it go poorly?
Actually, I just had a great example of this just last week. One of the sponsors that we work with is working with a CRO, and that CRO was actually on site the week before, because we were doing a site qualification visit. So we actually met some of the higher ups in that CRO during that visit. So I reached out to him about another study that the CRO was working on. And this was the first time that I've actually had that kind of experience with the CRO. It was immediate. Sent him an email. He responded instant almost. And within 3 days, we already had our budget escalated to the sponsor, and more escalation than what had been done for at least the last 3 weeks.
Mm,
So that was a great example. It was great to see that, especially on the study startup piece. Academic centers are harder to get started, so having that more immediate is definitely helpful. Where I've seen it go bad is that essentially the CRO having a lot of turnover is an issue, and not really knowing who our contact people are during those turnovers, or even sometimes not knowing the correct person to contact. As There is another issue as where parts of the CRO are not communicating with other parts of the CRO. So like this regulatory and startup not communicating well together, and not knowing where we are in the process of our startup as well. So
and I've got I think one comment that came through in the chat or question from Leslie Christie for you is do you have
mhm.
um, any examples or situations where direct sponsor contact has been declined or that you haven't been able to get in contact with a sponsor?
So most of the time, if I need direct sponsor contact, I'm actually having to get my providers to actually reach out. That's what it boils down to for the majority of our studies. Now, some of our rare disease sponsors actually are more, we can engage them more on more of a one-on-one because we have that type of relationship with them. Our rare disease tends to be a little bit more engaged with each site.
Mhm.
And I have actually had multiple incidences where they even come on site just to see what they can do, give us update, and not in the way that it's burdensome, because too much is, it's a fine line, too much engagement and too little engagement, right? So they've come on site just quarterly, and just kind of updated us. So it is rare disease. Pharma tends to do this really well.
Zena, I'd like to get some of your perspective on this as well. And Christy, thank you for that.
Yeah.
One of the things that you've said is you delegate the trial, not the relationship. And this delicate balance that Christy's describing of enough engagement, but not too much engagement. How do you see that from kind of the
Yeah.
other?
So one thing, like, thank you, Chris. I love your example because in some ways it's an outlier. Usually, when we discuss enabling sites to have more communication with sponsors, the idea behind it is that CROs are the gatekeeper of clear communication, just like better execution. But I love how actually your example was even about the CRO showing up at the sites and being there for you. And I think sometimes we think the problem is that the COOs are the barrier, but like it really doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be, no, we want to jump over the CRO to the sponsor. We just want someone qualified we can have the conversation with so that we can just execute and move further there. I'm very curious around too much and yes, too little engagement. Just coming the way we see it from my experience, we have been observing that site engage, like the better the partnership with sites is, the faster the timelines are, the more patients are recruited, the better the retention is. And it's often perceived as an anecdote. So maybe I would love to validate with Christy. So how do you view this even? Because I mean, from my time running sponsor-led trials, I would just say I was performing greatly, but just because I had great relationships with sites, I don't think because in some ways I was an overperformer. And there's like, so how can we make great relationship like the focus of how sponsors interact with sites? So I am very curious on what are the drivers from maybe your perspective, Christy, on what is a great relationship? Because maybe we talk engagement, like is there a difference between engagement and relationship? Because at the end, maybe someone you have a great relationship with, you don't have to see on a weekly basis what makes engagement the right type of engagement for the right relationship.
Great question, by the way. I think it's also going to be dependent on the site as well as the provider. My role as kind of the research program lead is to manage all of GI research, which is a large portfolio, as Dr. Wilder can attest to. But to be able to actually have that one person at each site who the sponsor is working with, that may be with just that person outside of just the PI, right? So kind of what my previous experience is having with the sponsor is having somebody like their scientific liaison. We would talk about the pipeline. They would also be like, okay, what are your investigators wanting to look at for them to even try to get funding for investigator initiated trials, right?
Yes.
Kind of like developing these long-term relationships that allows studies to come in a lot quicker, and we can prepare for them in advance. In addition, why I specifically said rare disease, there's in my experience, and this is just based off of my experience, usually what I have found is that those pharmaceutical companies, the higher ups that are managing that section, are really good at showing how much how important it is for them. And that, yes, I love research. I love doing research, but knowing that the people that have my back and want me to do well also love to see this and want to bring it forth to patients, the heart behind it really makes a difference to the site as well. That's
Yeah.
what I would say. Now, how to develop that, it is more, kind of site-based, but I would just say in general, for my group, it is really just working with them. I have, weekly meetings, with one sponsor of rare disease, just talking about what are we seeing? What are the inclusion exclusion criteria we're not that are having problems? Helping to give them in, my experience in order to, okay, can we make some changes to make this a little bit easier
Mm.
as well? And even my patient experience. I've had one sponsor actually change how they did drug administration, some of the patient related aspect of that in order to make it more palatable for the patient as well. So,
Well, and I'd like to, there was something that you had said a little bit earlier, Christy, and I'd like to Julius get your opinion on this. The impact, there's another topic I know we're going to talk about here next, I think that's near and dear to your heart, but on this communication piece, um, what is the impact of this communication needing to be escalated to you? Hey, if we need to get contact with the sponsor, everything has to be kind of escalated to you. And what do you see in terms of communication, friction in communication, and the impact that has on kind of the smooth running of the trial?
Yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, with any process, the more steps you put in there, the more delays in achieving the outcome, right? Or the goal. And also the
Mm.
more opportunities for there to be confusion or mistakes and so forth and so on in that process. And so in medicine and quite frankly in industry, generally speaking, it's always good to have a very clear, concise, streamlined process when doing any task, particularly when you have various entities involved. And what Zena and Christy is speaking to right now is this idea where when we create too many sort of steps in a process, in this case, the communication around a study, we're creating opportunity, number one, for delays. And so we're trying to recruit patients for studies. There's a timeline, there's a cost associated with that time and that timeline. And that gets delayed because of our inability to communicate effectively, with the relevant parties. You add me to the mix as a provider, and Christy will tell you, I'm pretty sure Christy likes me a lot, but I am also fairly certain that Christy hates having to reach me for meetings and whatnot because she probably has access to my calendar and she sees how ridiculous that is. She knows how often I'm rounding. She knows how often I'm traveling for conferences and so forth. And so it's not as if like the study that Christy's trying to speak to me about is the only thing I'm doing. In fact, it's not the only study I'm doing. And then,
Mm.
so there's so many factors that come into play when you start bringing the providers into it. It just really creates an really ineffective process for communicating the issue and arriving at a clear, concise, and quick solution. And that can impede the research process. And so I think, whatever we can think about when we think about our sponsor and we think about the role of the CRO, ensuring that around communication at least, we vet the best ways to communicate general things and create maybe more efficient ways to communicate quick, easy, urgent issues when it comes to site/sponsor communication. I think is something that needs to really be vetted and clarified on the front end. And who the contact is at the site, who's the contact with the sponsor, who's responsible for vetting things in the setting of communicating through the CRO effectively. I think that being very intentional about what that looks like on the front end, I think is going to be key in navigating that process effectively.
So some planning up front and setting some clear expectations, some kind of quality by design, even in the communication plan.
Yeah,
between-
exactly. Because we talk about the protocol, we may talk about the individuals at the site, the individuals in respect to the sponsor contact as well as the CRO. I don't know that I've ever really seen like a very clear, concise, like communication plan. And that's probably something that people need to be a little bit more intentional about. We do it in other spaces in industry, and in academia for that matter. But thinking about that as we design studies and what the relationship looks like between site, sponsor, and CRO, I think is going to be really important.
Mm. Well, thank you. I'd like to take us to our next topic, and I think it was good for us to spend a lot of time on what is clearly the obvious problem to everybody from that first poll question, which is the communication. The other thing that stood out to me from that first poll question, though, was what was on the bottom, right, which is around contracting and budgeting. And I think there may be some reframing here from the site perspective, but we'll see. Let's go to our second poll, and I'd like to get you all to interact with this a little bit. When planning your trials, how confident are you that your budgets and contracts reflect the true site workload? Okay.
This reminds me, actually, Chris, I got to send you a budget that I just put together.
Okay, we
We'll
have
see
results
how
coming.
reflective his budget is. Sorry.
I'm not very confident, Christy. I'm not very confident.
So we have some results here. I say the overwhelming majority here are somewhat confident. They're directionally correct, right, in terms of the budgets and the contracts reflecting the true site workload. We have 7% who are very confident. 18% are rarely confident, and then 4% who are not confident at all. And I don't think this is going to be a surprise, but Julius, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. What's your perspective on budgeting, contracting, and the friction there, and the impact that that has on the site sponsor relationship?
Yeah, what we've seen over time, generally speaking, well, and again, in all industries, including research and certainly in academia, is sort of the cost of doing this work has gone up. And as we think about particular patient populations, Christy alluded earlier to rare diseases. When trying to recruit patients, it can become much more, it is quite frankly, it's become much more difficult and complicated process, even with some of the like EMR tools and technologies that have become available. And so as we try to navigate ways to efficiently, again, recruit patients and so forth, there's costs associated with that. And even some of these new tools that are out there, there's a cost associated with that. And so in the setting of this, I think oftentimes, there is an underestimation about what the true cost of doing research is. And there's this huge infrastructure that we have to support that allows us to do research that is, ethical, that is accurate, and will result in, the type of efficient, successful recruitment for clinical trials that we want to do. And again, I don't want to sort of belabor the point, but I think it does go back to what Christy spoke to, this idea of communication on the front end, and what are the exact needs of the site. And so I think, often this is an issue with sponsors. And I'll say there's two things, and then I'll allow to speak. I can speak for 3 hours about this. The first thing I would say is that oftentimes there's an underestimation about the sort of burden and the cost of doing high quality research. And this is not, we're not Podunk, this is Duke. So we're doing high quality research. You have some of the best minds in the world in the space, in my setting, GI and hepatology, who are doing this work, the thought leaders. And patients come to us for that. And for us to successfully navigate that the way that we know works best for our patients and for you as our sponsor, there's a cost associated with that. So underestimating that is one thing. But the other piece to this, Collier, is this idea that when we come back to you with suggestions about, hey, this is what this is really going to cost, This is where we can sort of bring things down in terms of cost, but we'll have to move some things over here so that we can build a study that's going to be successful for you. That's where that communication piece comes back into play. I mean, Christy will tell you right now, we've been actively negotiating something with one of my studies I feel like it's taken 15 years at this point, because the back and forth through the CRO, then to the sponsor, and then finally we're kind of now more directly engaging the sponsor about it. But before we got to that point, it was like months, before we got to that point. Emails not even being answered. I mean, and so it's just really frustrating and difficult in that setting. So I'll say number one, underestimating the true cost of a study. In the setting of the negotiation process, which also, by the way, often includes our lawyers and contractors who are separate from myself and Christy. The lack of efficient communication and really trying to be as quick as possible and reactive in that process significantly delays study startup, which has a cost to you as a sponsor.
And there's a lot there. I'm going to try to walk through this piece by piece here. So I think, Julius, I have a follow-up question for you. I have then something for Christy, and then Zena, I have a question I'd like to get your thoughts on. But Julius, how, as we look at sponsors really competing to be sponsor of choice with sites, how does this part of the process impact your decision of prioritizing sponsors and which sponsors you want to do work with, all things being equals in terms of patient care and the asset itself?
Very much so. Christy will tell you, my wife, who works in research in a separate area here at the university, will tell you that she and I talk about it. Christy and I talk about it. I mean, the companies. I'm not gonna name any names, but like you can start to name the ones. They're like, oh man, this is an interesting study, but damn, I have to negotiate with, and it shouldn't be that way, right? Because we all, including the sponsor, want to do what's best for our patients and move the science forward. But it really does impact how we view the work and the research, because there is there's a fundamental need, right, for this enterprise to be successful financially so that we can do what we can for all of our patients. And we can't jeopardize that because I find a study interesting. And so, yeah, to your point, to answer your question, Colin, absolutely. If there's a reputation of being difficult or being unwilling to be realistic with respect to the costs, it will definitely impact how a site views working with you. And I've actually walked away from studies in that setting.
So, and maybe based on that last comment that you made, I want to maybe come over to Zena real quick. I have a question, which is that bad experience right up front. How does that, from your perspective, your experience, how does that initial contact, that initial impression, that site sponsor relationship impact study timelines, enrollment, the relationship, the actual exercise of the study?
So honestly, I find the surveys, the replies, it's literally displayed the issue we have currently in the industry. If we see that around 80%, they are somewhat confident about that the budget matches the work of sites. I'm like, okay, if it's really the case, then why we currently spend 12 to 18 months between site identification to first patient in, and around 60 to 70% of this timeline are contracting negotiation. If it was really the case, like when I am purchasing a product I want, the contract doesn't take more than a week from initial interest to closed contract. We won't be having this issue. And the other thing we talked to more than, just like this year, we had a study with over 400 investigators across 23 countries. And the trials where they have difficult contracting negotiations, they took 40% longer. It was on average 3 to 5 months longer. And I'm like, so, and this is where we have to sit and ask ourselves, how do we measure the confidence, right? Apparently we are not measuring it the right way. And the other issue I see is often sponsors and CROs, all our clients, we are all business entities, and we look at research sites and we expect like NGO organizations that are just like managed by on thin air. Like, and when you talk to site owners, and they're like, we are also a business organization that we run activities that require us to generate revenue so we can keep running research. And in that sense, like if we live in these type of societies, we must understand that we trade a service for a specific merit, and we cannot expect a service without rewarding the people for the work they do. So there is a lot of work that should happen there. When, like, literally, we just had, I had a conversation yesterday with a biotech company that is currently planning 11 clinical trials for 2026, and then we are discussing the site engagement strategy, when we should involve them and how should the relationship with them. I always say, please don't be just like dumb around budget negotiation. And this is also what is the objective of the clinical trial, why we are even sitting here. And I think sometimes because we have all those little steps, because the process is so long, it's hard to remember what's the goal, and then we get lost in these nitty-gritty things, and then suddenly we have this dynamic us versus them. And I mean, I sat in conversation where when you are like ridiculously negotiate 50 USD on this examination, or like 200 USD, I'm like, okay, so this will never end. And then yes, then it takes almost 15 years fails to get the contract run. So and this is where we see also research sites that if the contracting takes too long, they close it just to get their study startup fees, and then I'm like, we are done.
Hmm.
That was it. And then okay, then you have an open site that's recruiting 0 patients. But I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't want to work with this sponsor, but I knew the only way to access the just like to be paid for all the effort is to go to the finish line with a CTA signature. And I think we need to be aware of this. We have other companies who says, oh, like the CRO is managing the contracting, and for me it's a black box. We were supposed to have FPI 3 months ago, but like everything is taking too long. I don't know why. I'm like, did you ever pick up the phone and call that site to understand this? Like also think why no one comes up with it. It seems almost strange and far having the idea to just like pick up the phone and call the sites. I'm like, it is very surprising. Like even though the biotech clients we have, they don't feel the entitlement. Like okay, the CEO is managing it. I would like step in, and I don't want to engage there. Yes.
Yeah, I think so that one of the first things that you said, I think really struck me, which is if we were actually so close in our understanding of the cost and the budget, then it wouldn't take so long. The fact that this always takes so long and that it's such a difficult process is kind of the proof that we're starting far
Yes.
apart from our expectations. Um, the I think the last thing that you said, Christy, when we had talked, um, you had mentioned, I don't know if it's the same situation that Julius was just referencing, but you had referenced a contracting process that was taking months and said if I could have just gotten on the phone with somebody that could make a decision, it would have been done in 2 weeks. Right. What talk about kind of the interplay between communication, that first topic that we had, and this idea of just getting through the agreement process.
So first I have to say, I wanted to post so many emojis while Zena was talking right there. Like, I was like, where's all the emojis? I need to do hand claps. I need to do loves, whatever. Right. Cause, and I will say, I did also agree with the length of the negotiation as it related to the budget confidence. I think I'll leave my comment as that, because that is the biggest issue. I could go in on a lot on this one for sure, just like just like Dr. Wilder. But so I actually have multiple examples. It's not just Dr. Wilder's. We have
Mm.
actually had several. Well, so many I couldn't even count them on all my hands and toes over the years. We've actually lost contracts. We've also lost money because contracts that we were negotiating could not come to terms. And therefore, all the effort that I put into it you know, my provider and my division had to basically eat. So there's a lot of risk when we're even bringing forth a study. So one of the things that we're doing now is actually doing startup agreements. So essentially trying to get in that kind of first payment before we even negotiate, or at least to cover our initial cost.
Mm.
That's one thing that we're implementing. It's not mandatory, of course, but and then also kind of having at least a verbal agreement saying that it would cover the cost. What else did you want? Sorry. I was all excited about Zena's talks.
That was great. I think that was exactly what I was looking for there. I think there was a question that came in through the chat, and Julius, it looked like you answered it, but I'm not sure that it went to everybody and that everybody saw it. But the question was, would your preference be to work directly with the sponsor on the budget negotiations versus going through the CRO? And so maybe just a second on that.
Oh yeah, I think that would definitely be a much more efficient way, particularly on the front end, of getting good clarity about, again, sort of setting appropriate expectations for what's involved and successfully navigating that process. And I think if you don't want to do that on the front end, which I think we should, minimally, once you get past that first contract conversation and you begin to have a conversation back and forth, that needs to be escalated immediately. Not wait 9 months before you escalate it, but that needs to be a much quicker escalation if you're not having that conversation with sponsor directly on the front end.
I have a follow-up question here. So, but this is for Christy and Julius. I'm sorry. I would like to expand on this question even more, since we are in a world where the CRO services are getting more and more fragmented to fractional services, and I feel like the relationship and the communication, a lot of things that could go right or wrong happens, and during the study startup space. How much do you feel should the sponsor own that initial part of the trial before the execution training kicks off? Would you prefer that to having the CRO engaged, or rather just the contracting?
That's a great question. So you're talking about having sponsor involved during basically early startup and then transferring to the CRO.
Yeah.
That is a great question. I could see where that would be very beneficial. The fastest budget and contract I have ever seen here at Duke was directly with the sponsor, and it was 2 weeks. It was shocking. So all of my personal experience with sponsor has we get the budgets quick and we get the contracts completed quicker. So my personal opinion is the same with as Dr. Wilder's. Yes, I would want to contract you directly with work directly with the sponsor on those. I don't think that's a bad idea, Zena. I really don't. I think that would, working with the sponsor during the initial startup, especially because a lot of times when we're going into the protocol and really piecing it out, we have a lot of feedback to give. And we do that sometimes during the site qualification visit, but we actually give a lot of feedback. So being able to have that conversation with the sponsor to say, hey, if you do this, we can easily get your numbers that you need, right? And have that kind of good collaboration before the CRO is involved. I think that's a wonderful idea.
So
Yeah,
we have you, but sorry, Judith, please continue.
No, I was just going to quickly say, I think what Chrissy said there at the end is so important, because the assumption always is that having this conversation with us and the negotiations is going to result in higher costs. But I mean, I can think about a recent study that Chrissy and I had a conversation with the CRO, and it became very clear that the CRO was not quite there in terms of understanding protocol development for the question they were trying to answer. Whereas if we had a direct conversation with that sponsor, we would have been able to help them in a much more clear, concise, streamlined, and financially efficient way get what they needed in terms of that clinical trial. And so it can actually result in decreased cost overall, if we're involved in that conversation on the front end.
Yeah. So we have few biotech companies here in this webinar, Collier, so I really love this, because I had a few conversations, and yesterday with a client was like, okay, we want to initiate this work. When should we start talking to sites? And my first experience with engaging sites at large scale during the clinical development space, before even the real feasibility and so on, I was so amazed with the scientific engagements, but also, as you just said, that you don't even get only feedback about the protocol, but how can you run your assessments in a much more efficient way? How can you think about the eligibility criteria? How can you get your significant number in a smarter way? And like crazy the amount of insights you can get at that early stage. And you just think about all the amendments we get later on. And that's where my question to you and to Christy was like, shouldn't this sponsor manage that phase, because it impacts enrollment, it impacts amendment, again, enrollment, and then timelines. And if the sponsors own that, then the protocol is the right one. The relationship is a great one. And I assume things go smoother. Thank you. I think you can share this webinar later with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that takes us. Oh, sorry, Julius, go ahead.
I was really quick to say, I think that, it's important we acknowledge that we know sponsors have a lot to do, and they have many, many studies, not just my study, and they have to navigate that. But I do think that as you develop your studies as a sponsor, this piece that Zena is speaking to needs to be something that you think about on the front end again. And as you think about the complexity of your studies, the number of studies, that we begin to think about that process on the front end and owning more of it as you think about how you roll out new studies and develop your studies, because it really will make sure those studies individually are much more successful. And again, acknowledging how complex it is, broadly speaking, for all the studies the sponsor has to navigate, admitted.
And we previously brought up the idea of sponsors having a site advocate. So if I'm working with Pharma A, I have this one person that I am building that relationship with just for my site, for, GI, whatever, specific. But even though I work in GI, if you're bringing something that's, an asthma study, I know who to get you into contact with, right? So even though I might just be GI, the hardest part at Duke is trying to find who you need to contact, so, we will help you out, but having that kind of one person, sponsor on the sponsor side early on, I think is a wonderful, great idea.
So look, I think that what I'm hearing as a theme here is, in the budgeting and the contracting, it's not the dollars and the cents that are the problem. It's the communication, and it's the collaboration on the science, and it's the understanding that we're working together as partners to try to work to the best solution for everybody, that takes into account the work that we have to do as a site, but also we want to go faster. We want to accelerate. We want patients on these therapies. And I think that takes us into, I think, our last poll question, right? This idea of collaborating on the science and being a partner in the protocol. This is really phrased towards the sponsors, but if you're on the site side, I guess it would be how often does your sponsor do these things? But how often do you or your team talk to sites about the why behind your study? The science, the patient impact, why it matters. So the options here are every time we interact with sites, at key milestones. So that could be SIV when we do amendments, at IMs. Rarely, not a common part of our interactions, or never. You're not aware of ever having done this. So we'll give everybody a second here to lock in their answers to our poll. Okay, so everybody here is pretty confident that they've gotten the why at least once, right? That the why is a part of the site sponsor relationship. We've got 47% saying every time we interact with sites, 37% that say that they're pretty good about it at key milestones. 16% do say it's rare, but nobody says that this is never done, right? So everybody says that this is something that has been done. But I guess Julius, you really brought up this point of the opportunity to collaborate with the sponsor. around the science and around the protocol, I guess what has been your experience in how often the site or the sponsors are communicating to you the why, the importance, the science behind this?
Yeah, that's actually a really important question that you're asking here, for many reasons. In my experience, the PI initiated studies with partners and collaborators in industry, our sponsors, um, have gone great. I think that is a wonderful model for on the front end, collaboratively creating a protocol that is grounded in good science, that leads to a protocol on the front end being created that is realistic with respect to cost, and also in terms of the science of the research being efficient and successful, in that setting. I think that there have been multiple conversations I've had, Christy in the room, around the science of the research, but unfortunately, it's rare that that conversation has included the sponsor. It's often included the
Mhm.
CRO. And in that setting, the issue is that there can be a disconnect in terms of really fully appreciating the science, right? And the medicine around the topic, as a CRO versus the sponsor. In my experience, oftentimes the CRO has some understanding, but what they really understand is the research study, right? But there is a science behind that the sponsor has, knowledge of, and that's where you can really, in a collaborative manner, tweak protocols, look at sort of where costs are, have realistic expectations around, sort of your ability to recruit, where you can, again, set realistic expectations with respect to costs, and even
Mhm.
find cost savings with more streamlined protocol, in terms of how you do the research.
And just as a follow-up question there, so we talked about the science and the collaboration on the protocol in the context of the budget and the contracting piece and where can we find efficiencies, but maybe a little bit in terms of enrollment, like the opportunity to collaborate around the protocol and issues with things like eligibility,
Oh,
what
100%.
impact?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest thing that, I'm sure Christy and Zena probably seen, like, say that is a ridiculous exclusion criteria.
Mm.
um, because you're just going to delay your recruitment way out, because of a reason that is not clinically significant. Um,
Mhm.
and and that, I mean, that happens all the time. And often what ends up happening is that, they don't make the changes. We're not a part of that conversation. We can't have that conversation. You begin the study, you're 6 months, 8 months in, a year in, and they're like, well, what's the problem with recruitment? Well, we told you a year and a half ago that this, specific criteria was ridiculous and going to be a barrier. Now, are you going to have that conversation? Okay, now we can have that conversation. But then that conversation takes 6 months to have about making this change to the protocol. So now, 2 years later, you're making the change to the protocol that you suggested 2 years ago when you first met the CRO. And so that can be all avoided if on the front end you had the kind of conversation with the sponsor and the right individuals to begin.
Yeah, so Christy, I think I'd love to hear operationally then, what does that look like in the actual running of the trial, the difference between when you had the opportunity to kind of collaborate on the science, give feedback up front versus when you're doing this throughout, and how the actual conduct of the study is impacted?
Well, I think just on a personal level, you feel like your opinion matters, right? Like you were on the site side, if my coordinator is, giving information back, or if I am, or if Dr. Wilder, it feels like, okay, they're partnering with us to make this better, right? In
Mhm.
addition, I will also say it makes a big impact on the patient side too. Because if you're having that type of relationship and that kind of team building, it also relates to the patient. And and a lot of times, you know, we'll say, let us know, how is it going on your end? We'll let the sponsor know. Just like in my example with the medication administration, I received that feedback. I let the sponsor know that patient was floored. And, I think a little bit of proud that he actually had some input, into that as well. So it's not just this is the patient, this is the site, this is the zero, this is the sponsor. This is a team.
Hmm. Something you had said at one point, I believe, was that the passion of the sponsor team for the patient, for the therapy, for the science that they're
Mhm.
doing is something that you're looking for that actually makes a difference in how well you work with the sponsor. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, it's tangible. I mean, you can measure it, when the sponsor is engaged and really their heart is, we need to come up with something that is working for this patient population. It makes a world of difference to the site and to the patient. That definitely gets relayed back to the patient through my staff. When
Mm.
we're having those one-on-ones and those consent processes, that information of this sponsor is really looking to try to make this better for people in your situation.
Mm. And Zena,
And that makes a big difference, for that patient to know they're not just a number.
yeah, I feel like that was something that Zena had said a little bit earlier in the conversation. Zena, you mentioned that, what made you really good. It was the relationships and it was the passion for the science and the communication that you had with the sites that you were working with. I'd love to get your feedback on.
Yeah. So it's funny, my background is I'm a chemist, and it's like I spent 10 years in drug discovery research. And I remember when I joined AZ, and like I spent many years working on ADC preclinical, and then AZ had this great portfolio of ADCs with Enhertu and so on. And I was super excited. For me, it was like my baby. Like I grew up with them, with those molecules when I was like 20. I understood them. You just understand the breakthrough behind it, the idea. And so when we say, oh, we talk about science with sites, what do we mean by it? Like often you show a slide of a protocol, and you're like, this is the molecule, this is the receptor, that's how it touched, and that was it. But for me, that's not the science. That's like dry 3D figures that says nothing. Like literally for people it mean nothing. And then the other thing that we do is we think, let's talk science with the PI. We talk protocol and process with the clinical researchers, which is so absurd because it's the study coordinator when she sees the patient's file, she remembers, oh, there is this study I have to think about, not the PI. And I remember I would just sit with them and just tell them the story behind it, why this is a breakthrough, or when we start thinking about tumor DNA, just like, oh, can we actually anticipate cancer like a recurrence before a CT scan? Just like get them into the story. And this is like, it's not about do we talk science to sites? Do we have storytellers that we send to sites?
Hmm.
And because if you get them excited, then everyone is like, I can't believe I'm part of this journey. And then everyone wants to, and I mean, science is fascinating. I think it's like literally we see breakthrough and innovation before anyone else sees them, before they are in the market visible for everyone else. And we just treat them like the most boring thing. And then no one is excited about them. And so I strongly believe you need to get people out there and bring them. And so this is the one thing. And the other, yes, I think that site performance is nothing but site relationships, and people don't understand it. Like, okay, we have never measured it. We never measured the impact of it. I'm like, okay, just like check your phone. Who are the calls you pick up and who are the calls you ignore? I mean, I don't need to run a study to tell you that you don't like to talk to people you don't like. And I think this is the moment when we love using science and thinking we are smart and just like ignoring the reality. Yeah, honestly, that's what I think about it.
That's incredible. I think, some of the themes, I think that wraps up really well a lot of the themes that I've heard today. And I really appreciate you all joining us. I hear, look, if you want to be sponsor of choice, if you want to reduce the friction in those relationships, if you want to speed things up and improve outcomes for patients, treating your site as a partner, collaborating with them, finding the right balance of communication, setting expectations early, and getting aligned on expectations directly, and sharing your passion and telling your story for why you're even doing this thing, that the why matters and that the sites want to be a part of the why. Well, look, I really appreciate you all joining us today. I think this has been a great conversation. It's been great to hear all of your different perspectives. I do believe, though, that that's all the time that we have for today. If you did drop any questions and we didn't have an opportunity to get to them, we can follow up with you after the webinar. But thank you all so much. It's been great talking to you today.
And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best. Enjoy it.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.